Hi, I'm David Reilly. It's finally here, the very first episode of a brand new podcast. Welcome to People and Politics. So, Chloe, thank you very much for coming on the show and thanks for your time.
You're really welcome, David. It's great to join you. And I'm really delighted that you do this podcast. It's so important that you do. So thank you very much for that. And thank you for inviting me.
Not at all, thank you. And I'm not sure if you know that you're my very first guest on my very first show. I was just tell your PA, tell that, and I wasn't sure that, but you know what they say from acorns.
Okay. Well, let's make it great then. Let's make it the start of something beautiful.
That's it. Thank you. So have you just come back from conference?
Yes, I was there this week, and actually, in particular, what I was focusing on is a great passion of mine that has developed over the time I've been in public service, which is inclusive recruitment and talking about the future of the world of work. And I come at this particularly with a view to accessibility and inclusion from the perspective of disability. And obviously that flows directly from all the work I did while at the Department for Work and Pensions, but also from my constituency, because in Norwich, I brought together a wonderful team about 10 years ago to try to help more young people into local employment. We called it Norwich for Jobs.
Yeah.
And we went on to particularly focus on young people with health conditions or disabilities. So this is a huge passion of mine and a real golden thread that runs through a lot of what I've done. So in Manchester this week, I was with the think tank called Bright Blue, and we were looking at those themes and inclusion and innovation in the workplace. Of course, a lot of it comes onto AI nowadays, which is another very hot topic.
Yeah, that's and I'm sure I read somewhere that you've done tremendous work with youth employment in Norwich in your constituency. You've gained a lot of investment for that, so that leads on nicely for what you've done.
It's really truly important, and for a couple of reasons. I mean, from the individual's perspective, they get an opportunity that they might not have had. And whether, if it's a young person, then that might well be an opportunity at the outset of their life. But actually for lots of other people of different age groups as well, the chance to be trusted in work is huge. And unfortunately, for many with disabilities, this is a chance that can feel out of reach for those who want to work. I will say at the outset, obviously, work isn't right for everybody, and I'm not making that argument. But for those who do want to work, the key is to get people to get firms and get employers to make the reasonable adjustments, to understand that here is talent that could have been overlooked. And then from the firm's perspective, this is vital because you're looking at such a tight labour market that has been true for a number of years and is true in a number of different countries at the moment as well, which means you can't recruit so easily. So you've got to look to those unexpected places for the talent that your company needs.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. I'm sure we'll come back to that a bit later, but as an MP for Norwich, is that your home? Is that your home patch? Is that where you're from?
It is, and it's a real, I mean, it's a total honour to be able to represent
That
where you're
would
from.
be great.
It really is.
It would be great if that's where you've grown up and
Yeah, I grew up in West Norfolk, so out in the rural part of the rural west part of the county of Norfolk. But Norwich is, to us in Norfolk, Norwich is the metropolis, right? Norwich is the place where it's at. So, as a kid, I would come over in minibuses from school on school trips. I would be at the, I can remember coming over as a kid. with some partners from school as part of a science team going to compete at the local university, the University of East Anglia in Norwich. And I used to play a lot of badminton as well as a kid. And so, Norwich was the magnet, actually. Norwich was the sort of social magnet for all of us, many of us growing up. And then as a teenager, I had the opportunity to get to know my then MP, who was Gillian Shepherd, Baroness Shepherd now. And, she was a very senior politician, and she was a wonderful role model to me and showed me, that you can do things for your community, in a constituency role. And indeed do things for your country also, because she had also been a cabinet minister. So she's been an absolute mentor figure to me through all of that. But therefore got me started in the idea of, okay, well, perhaps I can make a contribution like that in Norfolk. And then in due course, I did. It took several steps to get there, obviously, but I was I'm really honoured to be able to say I've done
that. That's been, I'm sure that you went on to university at York, and you read English.
Yes.
And so were you political at that time? Were you starting to think about politics at that time?
Yes, I was. On one clear path, actually, which is that I'd had it through Gillian, who I've just been talking about. I had the chance to do some work experience in Westminster, and actually I spent a year before university working in Parliament for her and for another MP. And so, I mean, that gave me a taste, that just opened doors. That said, I did also take the view, firstly, that you need to gain a lot of other experience. You can't just rush headlong into politics, because you've got to have, you're asking people to place their trust in you, and that won't come if you're sort of just too, fresh and wet behind the ears and all of that. That's not fair to either them or to you. So experience is critical. But secondly, also, I do think that politics is a very practical subject. So it's not one that you study at university. It's not one that you sort of get a qualification in. You've got to be doing the stuff in your community in order to learn and to practice it.
That's yeah. And since you were first elected, I think in 2009, you've had a lot of really senior roles in government. And I think, am I right in saying you've served under 5 prime ministers?
Yes. Slightly too many prime ministers, obviously, but still, yes, there's a very small number of us in fact, a really tiny number of us who've served all 5 of the Conservative administrations since 2010. Yeah.
Good. And you've been head of the Department of Work and Pensions and Disability Minister, and I was going to say, all the rollout of universal credit and the reconstruction of welfare. Do you think that's been a success, and has it gone smoothly? Has it gone as smoothly as you thought it might have gone?
That's a great question, really good question. And I'm going to make a few points in answer to it, if you don't mind. I think the rollout of universal credit overall, big picture, has been a success, and it has gone reasonably smoothly. And I think the proof point of that actually was in the pandemic, because that system, and I mean the computer system, I mean the rules, and I mean the way that people were able to apply to that system worked, in a moment of maximum stress, when, thousands, hundreds of thousands of people needed it suddenly, sort of almost overnight. And it worked. It didn't fall over, which, some systems have done, of course, in the past, and in other countries, things can fail at government level. Of course they can. But this system worked. So yes, that's been a success. I also think, crucially, it's been a success on a principles point of view, which is that it is so important to help people to try work as opposed to feel a barrier that says, oh, it's not worth my while to try work, or I'm going to be financially worse off if I dip my toe into work. And that's what universal credit does. So I think both principles and practicality, it's the right thing, and it's worked. But I think there's more to do though, and this is where we come on to some debates that are going now. You'll have, you and your listeners will have seen about proposals to look again at the work capability assessment, and also the assessments in. So that's the assessment in ESA, but also the assessments, in the more widely in the disability system. And I think that's right, because again, there is sort of evolution there. People's circumstances, have arguably moved on in that 10 years. We do see different patterns. We do have greater medical understanding. We have a number of things that do merit then a fresh look. And for me, fundamentally, all of that has to come back to this point, which is we need to make sure that support gets to where it's needed. We need to make sure that is compassionate and properly understanding people's needs and people's challenges. But we also do have to ensure that nobody is disincentivized from trying work and being supported in work and independence where that's the right thing for them.
Yeah, I think around at the time that the work capability assessments were quite contentious at the time, because there were, whether mistakes or what if it called them, I think there were, some instances of unfair, people being deemed fit to work who were clearly not capable work, and also people with long-term health conditions that weren't likely to improve. So I think they were quite contentious at the time, but I recognise that the need for them.
Yes, and I think that's right. I think what you want is any welfare system has to continue to command, public trust, actually public support, but that's both from those who use it, as it were, recipients, but also those who, everybody, all of us, including recipients who pay for it through our taxes. It has to be able to command that broad base of trust and sort of based in common sense, really.
Yeah. Do you think the rollout of universal credit has made it any easier for disabled people to secure employment opportunities, or has it just made benefit rules more stringent? And are the two separate?
Very good question. Yes, I hope it has made it easier for disabled people as well as others, and its whole point, really, the clues in the name, the sort of universal idea of it means that it does have this wide span. However, there is stringency there, and I do think that's right, I suppose, for the point that I just made, which is that the system has to be able to be robust and it has to command trust. So to give this its name, I mean, there is the concept of sanctions in universal credit, where consequences follow. Actually, if you don't follow the commitment that you have as a claimant of the benefit. Now, typically that hasn't applied to people who are unwell or disabled. There has been a sort of a distinction there in the system. And I when I was leading the Department for Work and Pensions, we were quite clear that actually sanctions were, this was not going to be sort of the widespread experience of people who were disabled and who needed that support. So what we were talking about doing was tailoring the support that people got from job centre officials or DWP officials to people's circumstances, rather than some kind of blanket approach.
Yeah, I think at the time around 2011 or 2010, when the rules were changing, and without raking over old code, I think there's a lot of disabled people felt that there's a lot of people gonna felt that that it was that there's a whole thing that disabled people were not working because it was too easy to claim benefit, and whereas that felt uncomfortable to some people because there's a lot of people, disabled people, desperately want to work, but find it really, really hard to get employers to employ disabled people because, as it stands at the moment, employers don't have to employ anybody. They're encouraged to make reasonable adjustments, which is fine. But at the end of the day, they don't have to do anything or employ anybody. So I think at the time there was this thing that they weren't working, but desperately want to work, and it felt unfair to a lot of people at that time.
I can understand that. And speaking just as a plain old MP, I was there at the time in legislating that, the acts that that you're talking about back in I think sort of 2010, 11, 12. And yeah, these were deep debates, and rightly so. They must be. But what I also observe having happened in that time, actually, maybe in that decade compared to where we now stand, is there has been some cultural change, I think. I mean, really love to hear your insights into this. But it does seem to me there has been some progress in employers understanding the issues, being willing to tackle and understand the issues. The use of the Equality Act as the kind of backstop here, to basically make there be reasonable adjustments. By the way, I take your point that is reactive, not proactive. I understand that, and I do appreciate that can look difficult from the disabled person's point of view. But broadly, I think there has been a greater willingness amongst employers to do all these things, and I can only see that increasing. I hope that is on the up. I think I'm an optimist about that, not a pessimist.
No, I think you're right to be honest. I think it is given that because I read somewhere, I think the economic rates among the disabled community, I think they're about 50% or 55% compared to 85% of non-disabled. So the gap has closed. However, it still has the other way,
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Yeah, exactly. The so-called disability employment gap is it's an important measure. It really is, because what you're looking to see is two things, isn't it? One is that there's a greater number of opportunities and vacancies that disabled people are going into, but secondly, that point about equality and the idea that the gap, that there shouldn't be, so much of a gap with others, and so therefore I know the government continues to look at both of those points, both the absolute measure, if you like, of employment and the gap measure. Both are really important.
Yeah, before the DDA came in 1995, I think there was I think they called it the green card system, and it was far from perfect, but I think at that time there was a more measured approach to, for example, I think I'm right in saying that larger employers were expected to, employ a certain proportion of people with a green card or something like that. Whereas after 95, that was all done away with. So I feel it's not as measured as it used to be, because there's many employers would say if you ask them how many disabled people they employ, a lot of them would say, well, we don't have that information because people don't like to disclose. But that is the question: why don't they like to disclose? And so it's not I'm not saying the older system is better because it wasn't, but there was a way to measure that,
Yeah.
which I think people are lacking with the current system.
I think there's also some really interesting international comparisons on this, David, as well. And one of the things that I've very much valued doing in my time in leading the department and elsewhere as well is looking for those comparisons, because we should always be able to say that, you know, we are doing something that is, I hope, internationally leading, you know, and in many cases Britain is in that position, which is a very exciting thing to be able to work with. So in this field, for example, I was representing the UK at the United Nations in terms of the conference of conference on the rights of people with persons with disabilities, I think is their full title. And you know, at UNCRPD, what we were talking about was how do we keep pushing the frontier of this going forward, and how are we able to learn from other countries that do so. I mean, in many cases, actually, other nations were sort of coming up to us as the UK delegation and asking to learn from us, which I found quite a different perspective, perhaps, to what you might have in only internal UK debate. But critically, also, there's a lot to learn from others. So, you know, for example, some of the Scandinavian countries have interesting ways of doing this, although they don't think they've cracked it yet at all. In I think Germany and Poland, there are some quite interesting methods of sort of quota systems, a little like what you're just referring to. I was a little skeptical of a quota-based system because I wouldn't want it to get tokenistic. That's always the issue there.
That's a danger. Yeah.
So you've got to get to basically a real and true position where businesses realise that this is in their own interests to do, which it is. You know, in a tight labour market, you need talent, and you've got to keep looking wider and wider for that. And you know, your employees and your customers will expect that you are inclusive in what you do, and that means inclusive in the workplace, inclusive in processes. I also strongly argue inclusive in your physical design and in your technological design. All of that matters immensely. Inclusive tech, inclusive design, inclusive recruitment. That's, you know, good businesses realize that is in their interests to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Businesses need to see this inclusion as a positive thing that's good for business, and not just a tick box or something. They have to see it as it's a big talent pool out there, and they have to see it as an opportunity to draw from that talent pool. But employers don't always do that at the moment, but it's definitely changing. A bit earlier on, you mentioned the think tanks of this early, 2010, and the think tanks conference, for example. And there are many disabled people involved at that level.
There are, but I'd like to see more. And I think, obviously, ever-growing numbers will help to secure these arguments. I'm sure that's the premise of your question as well. But yes, I think there are. I think there are those voices. I mean, I could name, some really great people, and actually, I mean, you've just met one of my staff members this morning, but in actual fact, in close proximity to my work in Norwich and Norfolk, I can think of 3 different colleagues who have different disabilities, but who are instrumental in local politics, and that makes a difference at a community level. And then nationally speaking, I think we have, some particular leading lights. I'd like to see more. But we also have some interesting dedicated think tanks coming up. I can think of at least 2, and I'll make sure that you've got the URL of them so that you can publish it alongside the podcast, because people may be interested, and I'd love to see that movement grow.
Yeah, I think it's very important because, disabled people are often, and you probably know that, particularly in elections, and that we're often talked about, particularly in the context of welfare reform. But there's a lot of disabled people don't always feel
Yeah.
included in this, in the discourse, and the dialogue, and I think there's a lot of barriers. Would you agree that there's a lot of barriers that stop disabled people getting into not just frontline politics, but even the back end politics? There's a lot of barriers there that exclude disabled people.
Yes, I agree. With great sadness, I agree. And we want to, we must all work to bust those barriers down. On a related point, I thought it might be, it's probably worth dwelling on some particularly good role modelling that we have seen in recent years. And I think here of Rose Ayling-Ellis for the deaf community.
Right.
So what you see there with a deaf actress, a deaf performer, taking centre stage in major cultural event through the winter of that year. You really see somebody actually breaking down those barriers very, very actively. And she did so much through those programs to explain, her experience and to explain some of the challenges that people face. And so it brought it right out into the mainstream. It shouldn't have to be a sort of a ghetto discussion. It was right there in the mainstream, and that's absolutely as it should be.
Is Rose the woman that took part in Strictly?
Yes, exactly.
I had to ask because I don't actually watch Strictly, but I did watch it, and it was fabulous to see
Yeah,
her. And I think in one of her final performances,
yeah.
they stopped the music. And so it was so powerful. Thinking, oh my goodness, that's her experience. And that was an amazing moment in TV. It was good.
But it also meant something in politics, actually. So there was a real crossover because at that time, some of your listeners might know this history. But Rosie Cooper, who was an MP in Lancashire, and she was the child of deaf adults. So there's an acronym for this, CODA, CODA. She was a CODA. And she was bringing forward what's called a private members bill, so a piece of would-be legislation to recognise British Sign Language, as an official language in the UK. And I was the minister in the hot seat at the time. I was Minister for Disabled People. So, it came down to me to say, okay, can the government do this or can the government not do this? And, most of the sort of institutions would naturally just say, oh, no, no, we're not going to do anything like that. And I said, no, we're going to say yes. This is a yes, not a no. And we made it happen. So Rosie and I worked incredibly closely together to make that thing happen. And I think for me, it's probably one of the things I'm most proud of actually in my political work. But the point about Rose Ayling-Ellis is that she provided, she and all of that work on Strictly and also a few other things that were happening at the same time, provided that context in which those issues suddenly looked mainstream. Millions of
Yeah,
viewers were seeing her on their telly every week, and
brilliant.
this was a mainstream issue. So we just took that momentum and we did it, and we changed the law in a way that's been iconic for the deaf community. And that you've got to call out those alignments of the stars when they happen.
But yeah, it's hard to overestimate the significance of moments of that, Particularly, I remember when I was a child, you hardly ever saw a disabled person on 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 TV. So to see somebody like Rose on prime time television with millions and millions watching, it's really fantastic, and it's hard to, as can't overstate the significance of that, and I'm sure it'll continue to grow because there has been other contestants, I believe, yeah, I believe on Strictly as well. And can I just say that I don't watch. I don't watch Strictly. I do want to make that very clear that I'm not a Strictly fan, but 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 I believe I know that there are disabled people on Strictly, which is great, you know. So, so do you think? So what is it? Yeah, and this is changing the subject as I'm moving on. What is it Rishi Sunak has to do between now and the general election? Because it looked like a pretty rocky road. It's a rocky road for him at the moment. So do you think he's got a lot to do between now and the election?
Yes, I think there is a lot to do, and I think that's just obvious, to be honest. As you say, it's a really rocky patch, and in part that's because of major economic issues that in actual fact have applied across the Western world. Inflation as a particular point, has been uh, appallingly difficult for households, and many disabled people as well, in particular, by the way, as we all know, in terms of raised costs. So there's been some very, very serious economic problems that this prime minister, any prime minister, and indeed any prime minister in any country has had to deal with recently. So I think what Rishi has to do is I think he has to stick the course on that. And he set out that he will be doing that. He wants to halve inflation, and he's also set out that he wants to continue to reduce our debt in the economy and to grow the economy. I think that's absolutely fundamental. We've already spoken here about how we want that growth to be inclusive, and so let's keep working on that as well. But I think also he's got his eye on two other very major issues, which he will want to deliver on for people in the next, let's say, 12 months. And those are NHS waiting lists and stopping the small boats coming. Now, both those are absolutely critical. And I must say, are top of mind for many of my constituents. For example, in Norwich at present, one of the key issues in many people's minds actually is NHS dentistry. I don't know what it's like where you live, David, but that's a real issue in Norwich, and indeed hospital and GP waiting lists as well. So Rishi is right to seek to make progress on that, and I'm looking forward to supporting doing that in the last 12 months that I've got in Parliament. I don't plan to be standing next year, by the way, so I'm hoping to make my final contributions and then move on to fresh challenges. And he's right as well to go on small boats.
Yeah, it's a big thing, but I think cancelling the northern leg of NHS too. That's not going to go down well with people in the north, is it?
Well, look, I mean, that debate's going to run for a bit. So, we speak, we're having this interview the day after Conservative Party conference. But, that one will have some ins and outs for a while. I mean, speaking as a constituency MP, I can see some immediate benefits actually from the reprioritisation that he's done. Of the £36 billion of cost, there is actually already the ability to then spread that more widely across the country, including on a project in Norwich that we care about very much. So I can absolutely appreciate those benefits. And I do think many were concerned about cost overruns. That is something you have to be able to deliver against as any government, as any administration. And so actually what he's done here is grip overrunning costs, which I think is very sensible.
Which is sensible, because if he let it spiral, everybody would have a go on for that as well, So
welcome to politics. You can't get it right, can you?
There's still that I have to ask you, because I've heard a lot about Liz Truss's event that she had. Did you attend that?
No, I actually wasn't able to. I was speaking at the other event that I began the conversation by talking about.
because that's in quite a because people queuing down the stairs to get into that, and she obviously has still had a massive support and a massive following. I was just astonished.
Well, yes, but I must say, I mean, I think any advice I would offer to colleagues here is that we've got a job to do. We've got a job to do to work together to get those the things I've just been listing through. Get those right for people and for the country. That's what's really in people's minds, and I think that's what politicians will be judged against at the moment.
You've just said that you won't be standing again next year. So what next for you?
Well, I'm as I said at the very outset, actually, I'm absolutely honoured to have done the job I've done. I really am absolutely privileged to be able to have done that for a place that I call home, and to be able to serve for 15 years at the highest levels, and across things that I'm really passionate about. And I hope I've made a contribution. I hope I've made some good changes. That said, it's also been a very challenging time, obviously, in politics. We haven't even touched on Brexit and the rest of the pandemic, but it's been a tough old time, hasn't it, for all of us in that very same time period. And for me personally, I've also actually have had my two children in that time period, and a round of breast cancer. So it's not been a quiet time. And for me, it's time to take stock, I think, of that. Focus on the personal, focus on the family. The kids are still small. I'm looking ahead at their primary school years, and you want to be there, don't you? So it's time for fresh challenges on a different basis for me.
That's been like I've said since we, and wish you very well. And most of all, to say thank you so much for taking the time to record us with today. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you very much.
You're most welcome, David. And as I said at the outset, I'm so pleased that you're doing this. When you got in touch to say that you wanted to run this podcast, and that in doing so you would be able to be an additional voice for those with cerebral palsy and other disabilities whose voices and whose faces are not seen enough on different types of media. I applaud you. So thank you for inviting me to be on and be part of this. And I wish you every success in the podcast series.
Thank you very much. Thanks.